This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the rather famous Dr. Buck Melton.
Greetings.
Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be here.
I know you're watching the events in Washington with very careful view. I hope that things will work out well for you. You have a lot of support.
Well, I
in
appreciate
this
that.
part of the country.
And in this room, I have a lot of support.
And I mean that I haven't heard a single person going after that vice president spot. Not one. Not one person. It's an open runway. I mean,
yes. Well, they're waiting to see what happens. So.
Well, all right. I wish you well on that.
Thank you.
Well, we have a lot to talk about as the way the world goes. We have a lot of difficulties in the Middle East. There are problems, war, rumors of war, to quote the Bible. We have those events taking place. Much controversy, bloodshed, evil, struggle of good against evil. And the American presence there, in many ways, is predicated on a War Powers Act, which I think is about 18 years old.
Actually, 1973.
All right, I missed that. 1973.
In the wake of that wonderful little thing called Vietnam.
So, could you discuss that? So, this is an ancient law that was put in the time of Richard Nixon. Is that correct?
Well, how far back can we go? The president constitutionally is the commander-in-chief, and yet Congress has the power to declare war. Both of these things are expressly listed in the Constitution, but both of them are rather antiquated because to a degree the idea of commander-in-chief, I think the founders had actually sort of taking the field, which George Washington actually did once or twice as president. And the idea of actually declaring war has really sort of gone by the wayside since the United Nations Charter came into being. And yet you still have this tension between the two. In the nuclear age, the electronic age, the steam age, in which weaponry and communication can move very, very quickly and be very destructive, you don't have time to wait and consult with Congress if there's an ICBM strike on the way in. You have to be able to do something, which suggests that the commander-in-chief power is the more important of the two. And so that's why we have not had a formal declaration of war since 1942. Harry Truman essentially sent troops to help South Korea on his own initiative. And then in 1964, you had the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when the White House and the Defense Department maintained that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked U.S. warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. At that point, Congress passed a resolution, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that said, it did not say we are declaring war. It was a classic case of passing the buck. It said we authorize President Lyndon Johnson to do what he thinks is necessary to defend American interests in Southeast Asia. And we know what resulted from that, a huge buildup of troops, 58,000 Americans dead, Lord knows how many Southeast Asians died. And so in 1972, after the worst of Vietnam was over, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and then in 1973 passed the War Powers Resolution over President Nixon's veto. The short version of that is that when the president commits troops to combat, I think the actual phrase is hostilities, I haven't looked at it recently, then he has to let Congress know essentially immediately, within 48 hours or something like that. And then if Congress does nothing, if Congress just sits there and says nothing, institutionally does nothing, the president, is required to remove the troops within either 60 days or 90 days, depending on a couple of circumstances. To my knowledge, no president has ever acceded to the constitutionality of this resolution, but all of them have tended to abide by it voluntarily. And that's where we are today.
Well, there's plenty of room for discussion there, is there not?
Yes, indeed.
So we could say the amount of treasure and lives and blood and the just general amount of American resources have been used around the world in different places with relatively little impact from Congress. So the imperial president has just been acting pretty much as he wishes.
Yes. Putting
troops in and out, doing this and doing that in a pretty independent fashion. And as you recited the War Powers Act, it appeared that that the troops should be removed after a period of time, or there should have been some kind of check on these incursions of national power. There does not seem to be one. I mean, what's happening? Why do we have thousands of people all over the world fighting in different theaters of conflict? Why does that happen? How does that happen?
Well, there's several points to that. The first point is that the president has always had a freer hand when it comes both to military affairs and foreign policy. Some of that is hardwired into the Constitution, one of the best examples being what I've already said, the commander-in-chief power, his power to send and receive ambassadors, which is essentially an executive function. Another part of that is that Congress has acceded to that. Congress, of course, is big restraint, has always been the power of the purse. Once again, the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution has never been settled. The Supreme Court has never ruled on that. There are indications that it will probably never rule on that, though that may change. It's what's called a political question. But the presidents have said, you're invading our powers as commander-in-chief by doing this. That if you don't like what I'm doing with the military Congress, your proper role is simply not to fund the Army or the Air Force or the military. I can't send anybody anywhere if I can't buy the gasoline to get them there or the ammunition that they will use to fire at the enemy when they get there. So Congress has essentially let it happen. They have abrogated their responsibility to this, and so here we are.
Well, let's discuss the situation a bit with the recent difficulty in Iran, President Trump making pretty inflammatory statements, really, I guess, unlike Theodore Roosevelt. He was not speaking softly and carrying a big stick, but the contrary, possibly.
Yes.
But
well,
but I mean, it was spooky. It's a spooky situation. I think many people thought, well, this is pretty spooky. This one person who many people would say has substantial personality disorder. I mean, at least in leftist circles, that would be the statement that's made. It was almost like Dr. Strangelove or what strange aggregation of power in the hands of an unstable person. This would be the last viewpoint, who could just push a button and really kill millions of people just like that. What sort of restraint exists on these circumstances? And it's made, I think, more obvious with the advisors. There have been people of some rectitude that have been advisors, and they've, one after the other, been guillotined, so to speak. They've left. And so I think the country is watching this situation with intense interest. And presumably, maybe everything is going to be well. Maybe this is the way that one plays checkers in geopolitical arena. Maybe that's the situation. But what restraint can the country exercise on a commander-in-chief who is at the minimum making very inflammatory statements, maybe with reason, and seems to have the ability to really do something that could be against both national and world interest? And it appeared to me that the Senate should be advising and giving consent. There should be lots and lots of interchange, particularly in circumstances that are not the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of story, yes, where missiles are on the way. We're a long way from that set of circumstances. What could we do, or what does the Constitution say, or any comments?
Well, the Constitution doesn't say a lot. Ultimately, and once again, I think we've mentioned this before on the show, and if not, we certainly need to mention it. John Adams' idea of a government of laws and not of men. And by that, I think he means you know up front what rights, duties, and obligations exist, what restraints exist, and secondly, that power will not be abused. But I would say that if there is no internal check, you can have all the laws in the world on the books, and if people don't want them to be followed, then they're worthless. I think the idea is if you've got a president that's out of control, somebody would step up. Well, first of all, I think the first line of defense is that the immediate advisors will say this is a bad idea. What if the president then disregards that and says, I'm the commander-in-chief? Then you wonder if we'd have a 7 days in May kind of scenario here. I think the ultimate direction that goes in is the 25th Amendment. What if a president is incapacitated? But what if it's not true mental incapacity? What if it's just a massive policy disagreement? And here we get into arguments. If you've got a president who is willing to launch a massive first strike, nuclear strike on an enemy, is that something that we could call insane? Could we say, well, that in itself shows a lack of capacity and would allow us to invoke the 25th Amendment? Ultimately, of course, the biggest check is, well, if we don't like what this president is doing in foreign policy, we vote him out, the election. The problem with that is things move very fast in the modern world, and 4 years can be a very long time. It only takes 30 minutes to destroy the Northern Hemisphere if it comes right down to that.
Well, I guess what I'm getting into is the discussion about use of U.S. national power in all kinds of strange situations that seem to be poorly regulated,
yes,
to phrase it that way. And indeed, when an effort is underway to extract our forces, our military from different places, many people object to it. So we've been entangled in the Middle East for decades. I have to say President Obama wanted to shift to Southeast Asia or shift away, but we seem to be entangled in the Middle East. And President Trump has, at least in Syria, said, well, we're going to pull out. And then it was terrific criticism. The forces are diminished. It seems to me that there ought to be some kind of rejigging,
yes,
of our national political arrangements to restrain the use of national power, except in circumstances that are really obvious. And so that we don't get it. If we look at the situation in Iraq, what a fiasco. We've put $2 trillion, thousands of people injured, and the the country seems to want us out of there. And the people that would want us to stay there only want us there for their own self-interest. Yes. Maybe make some money, maybe protect them against the bad guys. And so we're in a really unacceptable situation.
Yes. Well, Iraq is not Afghanistan, but it reminds me of what somebody, and I should remember who it is, said about Afghanistan, that it's where empires go to die. If you
yes.
look at the trouble the British had there, if you look at it helped bring down the Soviet Union. I'm not sure that it could be fixed with regard at least to the Middle East, and maybe with foreign policy totally. I'm not sure it could be fixed by just new constitutional procedures. I think it's got to be a cultural point that to have a good, stable, long-term foreign policy that looks ahead by decades or even centuries, first of all, you've got to say it is our nation state, it is our community, it is our civilization that's important, and it's more important than any short-term political gains that a political party or a political actor might have. And of course, if you're going to do that, then you run into the deep state problem. And one of Trump's big criticisms is the deep state. These millions of federal workers have their own agendas and they're not willing to listen to me. So those two ideas are mutually incompatible. You can't come in and upset the apple cart and change things completely. Example, I think the problem with Trump getting out of Syria is not that he wanted to get out of Syria. I think that the Middle East is a quagmire for the United States. It's that he apparently woke up one morning and said, get those people home. There was There was no testing of public opinion. There was no announcement saying we're going to be leaving 6 months or a year from now. It's just bring them home. And that has a tremendous impact on foreign policy. It's like a short-term train wreck. And then once the Turks moved in, Trump sent people back in. And it's like, well, why did you put them back in when they were already there? So I think that's the sort of thing that you're worried about, if I'm hearing. I think you're right to be worried.
Well, it's just the world's a small place, getting smaller.
Yes.
There are lots of contentious, difficult situations in the world. The exercise of U.S. power, in my opinion, needs to be restrained, and a great deal of care needs to go into exercise of our national will. We'd be very restrained about doing things, and when we say we're going to do something, do it, kind of Teddy Roosevelt-esque, and we don't have to bluster otherwise. Okay, that would be a reasonable thing to do. The question is, how do you do it in this political climate?
Well, yeah.
And particularly if many of President Trump's ideas resonate well. Maybe he's got a lot of good ideas. The other side, many people would say, have a lot of bad ideas. So if Trump does, what do? It seems like it's Hobson's choice. You can't really extract the policy you'd like to have under the circumstances that exist now.
And that's why I say it's really cultural. And I can think of two areas that, especially with regard to the Middle East, but one of these is a generality. If you think of Lord Palmerston I think it was Palmerston in the 1800s, who said England has no permanent friends and it has no permanent enemies, but it does have permanent interests. And our foreign policy is to do whatever seems best to us at any given moment to encourage those long-term interests. Well, that works pretty well as long as your country is ruled by an elite who all came out of the public school and Oxford's traditions, and they're the landed aristocrats with the same economic interests, and so they're all pretty much on the same page. We don't have that in the United States. So the Democrats come in and they've got one plan to do something, and then the Republicans come in and they've got a plan to do something else. Even within the Republican Party, you've got the paleocons and you've got the neocons who are going to play things totally differently. So you can't make long-term planning. It's a recipe for our internal discord in the United States is a recipe for a schizophrenic foreign policy.
Well, now, is the place to do these things? Is it an international organization like the UN? Now, it's a bad name in many places. Mm-hmm. The structure of it, you could say, well, is this the kind of appropriate structure for this kind of organization? We have a Security Council, I think, with a few votes, and then you have the General Assembly, and with many, many countries whom are many of them are, shall we say, not ideal places to live. They have lots of problems. And so the structure that has been put together for the UN might not, maybe we need Madison to do something with it. Yes. But reforming the UN, maybe that's something that needs to occur. I mean, people are reluctant to, I guess, take steps in that direction. But in the Middle East, it would appear that some kind of quasi-international arrangement would be a useful thing, as opposed to the U.S. sort of getting in the middle of things and then spending the predominant amount of lives and treasure, and at the end of this, just getting nothing, just a fistful of ashes. What on earth did we accomplish in Iraq? What on earth did we accomplish? And it makes it, the wisdom of George Bush Sr. seems really to resonate here. He seemed to have a very good sense of statecraft. Okay, the bad guys are out of Kuwait, and we didn't go all the way to Baghdad, and we're just going to cool it, and we're not going to get entangled, and we protected our national interest. The oil, the petroleum, the oil supply of the Middle East was protected.
And that was a situation in which UN collective security actually worked, because he got a UN resolution in favor of it.
So it seems like that would have been an appropriate policy. Mm-hmm. And then if you look, which brings us to another point of view, we have exercise of American power often is dependent on the spin that occurs on television, on the pundit saying whatever, or the pictures that are shown there. For instance, they might show, well, some young child begging, please come help me, America, or something like that. And contrary-wise, they might show a person that had been napalmed and horribly disfigured by use of American power. But there's a lot of sophistry going on to attempt to influence American foreign policy. And not only that, our foreign policy is being influenced by extra national interests. So the people that have they have their own agenda, and they're influencing American media. Lobbyists in Washington are spending money, and we're in a situation where the public is kind of between two stools here. Who should you believe? What information that you're getting? And it's made even worse by the lack of trust that people have in our security agencies. Just look at the fiasco that occurred right down the line in the idea of going into Iraq the second time, and the 9/11 story. Mm-hmm. I mean, all kinds of fiascos are out there. So it used to be, I could say this, that if the CIA or the intelligence agency said something, then you'd have to say, we believe these guys. We believe them. That's what's up. But the spin that's out there, I guess you'd say the rectitude of our security agencies is a little uncertain, at least to somebody out in the provinces,
yes. Well,
respecting what they do.
I wouldn't go too far down that direction. I know that our intelligence agencies, as Ian Fleming once pointed out through one of his characters, that we're not natural conspirators. We don't naturally play the game very well. And sometimes it has seemed certainly oafish, like exploding cigars for Fidel Castro,
right,
and that sort of thing. But let's certainly cut them some slack, that we've probably got the biggest target on our back of any country on earth, and it's been that way for decades. And it's sort of like in nuclear war. Our intelligence agencies have to bat 1,000, because if they bat just 999, if the Soviets had launched a massive ICBM attack on us, and if just one missile had gotten through, that still would have messed us up horribly because of the destructive power of things. So we don't see all the victories that they carry out. That's the unsung side of things. It's the one failure that we really remember. And because a single failure in our world of modern technology can be spectacular and have tremendous consequences.
Well, so what's the scorecard? And we really understand.
We don't know.
My understanding a little bit about these intelligence agencies, mm-hmm. It used to be sort of like, I won't say James Bond, but really tough, really intelligent, tough people that were trying to, without any qualms, do something. Now, mm-hmm. I think there's a substantial amount of political correctness, mm-hmm. a substantial amount. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, well, do we have a diverse organization here? Is it diverse enough? We have these people that said something unpleasant, and they were rude in the the coffee, around the coffee urn, and they're going to be punished. So are the political correctness that's endemic in the country, is that having an impact on things? And also, what I want to bring this up, we have a lot of international interest that play itself out in our policy. So, for instance, the idea of going into the Middle East and into Iraq, if we can remember that this catastrophe of the second war there, I well remember this. Mm-hmm. The Shiite people were on television saying, we're sure there are nuclear weapons, we're sure. And the real story behind this was that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and he was viciously doing everything he could to injure the Shiites in the country. Mm-hmm. And the Shiites were trying to find a way to take him out. And there was a naivete in our intelligence agencies about exactly who was saying what for what reason. And it turned out to be this extraordinary catastrophe, extraordinary one, and doubtless influenced by the predispositions of George Bush Jr., which I won't get into, but there's lots of, what can I say? I won't go there, about living up to his father's tradition and the fact that people who were allegedly were going to try and assassinate his father, or all of these things played a role in this terrible decision. And so we're to continue on this subject. If the American people are going to take orders out of a black box, they have no idea about what's in the black box, there's a suspicion that something is amiss there, then we need to have some kind of, our representatives need to make certain that that black box is being carefully dealt with. And if there's interchange with the politicians that we have, I mean, speaking, well, there are many good people, but it does give one pause when one talks to the politicians that are in Washington about their abilities to climb that mountain.
Well,
does that sound, I mean, that's...
Yeah, well, you're
raising, that wasn't too mean to the politicians.
Well, you're raising the classic case of who watches the watchers.
Yes.
And has any civilization ever come up with a good answer to that?
Yes.
In a civilian, in a non-national security context, and I was just mulling this today, that immediately after the American Revolution, that as the War for Independence is still going on, 1776, 1777, 78, a couple of states, one of them I believe is Pennsylvania, and I think one or two others, when they wrote their new state constitutions, came up with a fascinating device, and I don't know why it did not persist. I don't know why it's not been adopted more broadly, because it died out pretty quickly. It only lasted a few years. The idea of what was called a council of censors, that I think every year or every 2 years, it was essentially a fourth branch of government. It would be called into being, and the council of censors would then review every law that the state legislature and governor had passed and said, is this good? Is this something we want to keep? Is this something that they had the power to pass? So a group to watch the watchers, if you would. And I think that's a wonderful idea, and I don't know why it didn't last. So, and I don't know how you could implement that when you're talking about classified intelligence.
Yes.
But it's simply, it's a wonderful stimulus to thought.
Well, if we're considering the world right now, for instance, the issue in Iraq and assassinating the Iranian general, the story is he was about to kill 1 million American people. He himself had the power. He was going to push a trigger that was going to kill many, many Americans. And he'd done that in the past. Okay, that's your assertion. Tell me why you say that. And well, we can't tell you. They might say to Joe Sam down here in Macon, Georgia, we just can't let this story out for classified reasons. But we're going to tell people in Congress about this. And the question, at least what I've heard, is they do have some communication.
But
how effective? Well, what goes on there? I mean, are the people that are on these committees, are they able? This is an important issue. This is how the American Republic is protected. I mean, Are they actually doing something?
Well, I don't think that they really were very forthcoming this time. And normally the Intelligence Committee, you would expect the members of the opposite party to scream bloody murder, maybe even do some leaking, but certainly saying, all right, we're not going to leak details, but we're saying we're not convinced by this. But then you have to ask the question, are they just simply saying that for partisan purposes? And the final thing I would say about that is it's Trump having it both ways. Deep state conspiracy, deep state conspiracy. Oh, the deep state told me that this was a bad guy, so we went and killed him. Well, do you trust them or not?
Okay, on that note, Bucky,
Yeah.
thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
once
sir.
again a very erudite discussion as usual. Thank
This
you.
program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.